the people who chose Barabbas. Today's story changed the course of humanity, a choice made, a decision that will echo for centuries. Whom do you want me to release to you, Barabbas or Jesus, who is called the Christ? Matthew 27:17. This question, posed by Pontius Pilate, set off a chain of events that would lead to the most significant sacrifice in history. You are about to follow the crucial moments that led the people to choose Barabbas, a known criminal, instead of Jesus. The sun had barely risen in Jerusalem, but the streets were already bustling with activity. It was the eve of Passover, one of the most important festivals for the Jews. The air was thick with anticipation and palpable tension. Rumors spread like wildfire among the population. Jesus, the man many called the Messiah, had been arrested during the night. Some said he was a troublemaker, while others saw him as the long-awaited hope. Opinions were divided, but everyone knew that something important was about to happen. In the palace of Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, the atmosphere was even more tense. Pilate had been awakened early with the news of Jesus' arrest. He was aware of this man's reputation and knew that dealing with this case would not be easy. The Jewish religious leaders were determined to see Jesus condemned, but Pilate wasn't convinced of his guilt. As he prepared to face the day, the governor pondered how he could navigate these turbulent waters without causing an uproar. Meanwhile, in the dark and damp cells of the prison, two men awaited their fates. In one cell was Jesus, silent and serene, despite the visible marks of the mistreatment he had endured overnight. In another cell, not far away, was Barabbas, a man known for his violence and for leading a rebellion against the Romans. Barabbas was restless, aware that his execution was near. Little did he know that his fate was about to change drastically. In the city, people began to gather in the streets and squares. The buzz grew as the news spread. Many still remembered Jesus' triumphant entry into Jerusalem just a few days before. How could things have changed so quickly? Some passionately defended Jesus, recalling his teachings and the miracles they claimed to have witnessed. Others, influenced by the religious leaders, saw him as a threat to traditions and stability. The chief priests and elders wasted no time. They moved through the crowd, whispering, persuading, manipulating opinions. They knew this was their chance to get rid of Jesus once and for all. They painted Jesus as a blasphemer, someone who threatened not only their religion, but also the fragile peace they maintained with the Romans. Their words fell on receptive ears, especially among those who feared change or felt threatened by Jesus' revolutionary teachings. As the morning progressed, the crowd grew and became more agitated. The air was thick with conflicting emotions: curiosity, fear, anger, and confusion. Many who had heard Jesus speak or had been touched by his acts of kindness were baffled by the situation. How could someone who preached love and compassion be considered a criminal? Others, however, were easily swayed by the inflammatory rhetoric of the religious leaders. In the city center near Pilate's palace, a group of Roman soldiers stood watch. They observed the crowd cautiously, ready to intervene at the slightest sign of unrest. To them, this was just another dispute among the Jews, but they knew things could quickly get out of hand. The Romans were masters at maintaining order, even if it meant using force. The tension in the air was almost tangible, and the soldiers tightened their grips on their weapons, prepared for anything. Inside the palace, Pilate received reports on the situation in the streets. He knew he needed to act wisely. As governor, his primary concern was to maintain peace and avoid an uprising. Pilate had dealt with charismatic leaders before, but something about Jesus intrigued him. The reports he received spoke of a man who preached peace, not rebellion. However, the pressure from the Jewish leaders was intense, and Pilate knew he couldn't simply ignore their demands. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, word spread. Pilate was going to address the crowd. It was customary during the Passover festival for the governor to release a prisoner as a gesture of goodwill. This year, however, the choice would be more significant than ever. People gathered, eager to see what would happen. Many still hoped that Jesus would be released, confident that his innocence would be recognized. The guards began to clear a path through the crowd, creating space for Pilate to address the people. The buzz quieted momentarily when the Roman governor appeared, his imposing figure contrasting with the restless crowd. Pilate looked out at the multitude, his eyes scanning the anxious and hostile faces. He knew that his next words could either calm or ignite the situation. With a gesture, he called for silence, and the square fell into a tense hush, all eyes fixed on him. "People of Jerusalem," Pilate began, his voice echoing through the square. "As is customary during the feast, I must release a prisoner. Before you stand two men, Jesus, called the Christ, and Barabbas, the rebel. Which one do you want me to release?" Pilate's words fell like stones in still waters, creating ripples of murmurs and heated debates among the crowd. The people were divided, and opinions began to clash like waves in a storm. As the crowd absorbed Pilate's words, the religious leaders intensified their efforts. They moved swiftly among the people, whispering, persuading, manipulating. "Ask for Barabbas," they urged. "Jesus is a threat to our faith, to our way of life. Barabbas may be a criminal, but at least he fights against the Romans. Jesus wants to change everything we know and love." Their words found fertile ground in minds already predisposed to fear and distrust. In the crowd, conflicting opinions collided. Some, recalling Jesus' teachings and the miracles they had witnessed, passionately argued for his release. "He healed the sick," one shouted. "He fed the hungry," another exclaimed. But their voices were drowned out by louder, more aggressive cries. Fear and manipulation were doing their work, turning the tide against Jesus. Pilate watched the scene with a mixture of fascination and concern. He didn't fully understand the animosity toward Jesus, but he could feel the power of the crowd growing. As a seasoned politician, he knew that the will of the people, even when misguided, was a force to be reckoned with. Still, something within him resisted the idea of condemning a man he believed to be innocent. As the moments passed, the atmosphere in the square became increasingly charged. What had begun as a division of opinions was rapidly transforming into a unified clamor. "Barabbas, release Barabbas!" The cry began to echo, first in isolated voices, then in groups, until it became a deafening roar. The crowd, like a powerful wave, seemed to move in a single direction, driven by an almost palpable force of emotion and manipulation. Pilate raised his hands, asking for silence once again. The crowd quieted momentarily, all eyes fixed on the governor. "And what shall I do with Jesus, called the Christ?" he asked, his voice heavy with significance. For a moment there was a weighty silence, as if time itself had stopped. Then, like thunder, came the response, "Crucify him." The cry was so intense, so laden with hatred and fury that even the Roman soldiers were taken aback. At that moment the decision was made. The voice of the people, manipulated and guided by the religious leaders, had spoken. Pilate looked once more at the crowd, then at the Jewish leaders who smiled with cruel satisfaction. He knew he was witnessing a moment that would be remembered for generations. With a resigned gesture, he ordered Barabbas to be brought forth. The criminal, bewildered and incredulous, was led out of his cell, while Jesus remained silent, accepting the fate that was unfolding before him. As Barabbas was led into the square, the crowd roared in approval. The man they had chosen, a known rebel and murderer, was being released. At the same time, Jesus, the man who had preached love and forgiveness, was being condemned to the most brutal death the Romans knew. The irony of the situation was not lost on some in the crowd, who watched the events with horror and sadness. But their voices were drowned out by the frenzied celebration of the majority. Thus ended the mourning in Jerusalem, a mourning that would change the course of history. The people had made their choice, influenced by fear, manipulation, and a distorted understanding of events. They had chosen Barabbas, a symbol of rebellion and violence, over Jesus, the Prince of Peace. The consequences of that decision would be felt not just on that day, but would echo through the centuries, shaping the future of faith and humanity in ways no one in that square could have imagined. As Barabbas was released, swallowed by the exultant crowd, Jesus was led inside the praetorium. The contrast between the two men couldn't have been more evident. Barabbas, with his eyes wide with surprise and relief, stumbled toward unexpected freedom. Jesus, on the other hand, maintained a quiet dignity, his face marked not by defeat, but by unshakable resolve. The Roman soldiers, accustomed to prisoners who fought or begged, were intrigued by Jesus' calm demeanor. Inside the praetorium, away from the eyes of the crowd, a brutal ritual of humiliation began. The soldiers, perhaps seeking a reaction from the silent prisoner, started mocking Jesus. "So you're the king of the Jews?" they taunted, their voices dripping with sarcasm. A purple robe, a symbol of royalty, was thrown over his bloodied shoulders. The irony was palpable, a royal mantle over a body already marked by scourging. In their cruelty, the soldiers failed to see the profound truth in their mocking actions. One of the soldiers, with a twisted smile, wove a crown of thorns. With exaggerated flair, he placed it on Jesus' head, pressing it down hard. The sharp thorns pierced the skin, and rivulets of blood began to trickle down Jesus' face. The pain must have been intense, but Jesus made no sound. His silence was more powerful than any cry, unsettling even the most hardened soldiers. They expected pleas, cries of pain, but found only serene resignation. Meanwhile, outside, the news of Barabbas' release spread quickly through the city. Some celebrated, seeing him as a symbol of resistance against Roman oppression. Others, however, began to question the wisdom of their choice. Barabbas was known for his violence, for leading uprisings that often resulted in innocent bloodshed. Compared to Jesus' peaceful teachings, the people's choice seemed increasingly misguided to some. In the house of Caiaphas, the high priest, the atmosphere was one of restrained celebration. Their plans had succeeded. Jesus was condemned. Yet a sense of unease hung in the air. Some of the younger priests voiced concerns about the possible consequences of their actions. What if his followers caused trouble? One asked. Caiaphas, with a stern look, replied, "It is better that one man die for the people than that the whole nation perish." His words, though spoken with political intent, carried a prophetic weight he did not understand. Back in the praetorium, the mockery continued. A staff was placed in Jesus' right hand, a cruel parody of a royal scepter. The soldiers knelt before him in mock reverence, shouting, "Hail, King of the Jews!" Then they stood, striking him, spitting on him, tearing the staff from his hand, and using it to beat his thorn-crowned head. With each blow, the crown dug deeper, intensifying the pain. Yet Jesus remained silent, his eyes reflecting not hatred, but a compassion his tormentors could not comprehend. In the streets of Jerusalem, the atmosphere had shifted. The initial euphoria of the crowd was giving way to palpable tension. Many who had called for Barabbas' release now felt uneasy. Rumors began to circulate about the events inside the praetorium. Some said Jesus was being treated with a cruelty beyond the norm, even by Roman standards. Others argued that he deserved his fate for proclaiming himself a king. The city was divided, the collective conscience beginning to weigh with the consequences of their choice. Pilate, observing the events from his elevated position, felt increasingly uncomfortable. He had bowed to the crowd's pressure, but something about this prisoner deeply disturbed him. Jesus' dignity in the face of torture, his eloquent silence, all went against everything Pilate had experienced in his career as governor. He began to wonder if there was a way to reverse the situation, to save this man who was clearly not an ordinary criminal. As the morning progressed toward noon, the sky over Jerusalem began to darken in an unusual way. It wasn't rain clouds, but a strange and oppressive darkness that seemed to descend upon the city. Many looked up with apprehension, interpreting the phenomenon as a sign. Some saw it as divine wrath. Others lamented it as a harbinger of dark times to come. The change in the sky seemed to reflect the moral darkness that had settled over Jerusalem. In the temple, the priests were preparing for the Passover rituals, seemingly indifferent to the drama unfolding in the streets. Yet even there, whispers and uneasy glances were exchanged. Some of the younger priests expressed doubts about the justice of what was happening. "Wasn't this the man who healed the man born blind?" one asked quietly. "Yes, and they say he even raised a man from the dead in Bethany," another replied. But these voices of doubt were quickly silenced by the stern looks of the older priests. Outside the city walls at Golgotha, grim preparations were underway. Roman soldiers were inspecting the crosses, ensuring they were securely fastened. They performed this task with mechanical efficiency, accustomed to the routine of executions. To them, this was just another day of work. But there was something in the air, a tension that even these hardened soldiers could feel. They exchanged uneasy glances, sensing that this execution would be different from all the others they had carried out. Back at the Praetorium, Pilate made a decision. He ordered that Jesus be brought before the crowd once more. As the soldiers led him out, a murmur ran through the crowd. Jesus was nearly unrecognizable. The purple robe, now stained with blood, hung from his shoulders. The crown of thorns was firmly embedded in his head, and his face was swollen and bruised. Pilate, pointing to Jesus, declared to the crowd, "Behold the man." His voice carried a mixture of contempt and reluctant admiration. The crowd's reaction was immediate and violent. Cries of, "Crucify him," filled the air again. The chief priests and their officers led the chorus, their voices rising above the tumult. "Crucify him! Crucify him!" they shouted, inciting the crowd. Pilate, frustrated and exasperated, responded, "Take him yourselves and crucify him. As for me, I find no basis for a charge against him." But the Jewish leaders insisted, "We have a law, and according to that law, he must die because he claimed to be the Son of God." These words caused even more unease in Pilate. He took Jesus back inside the Praetorium and began questioning him again. "Where do you come from?" Pilate asked, but Jesus gave no answer. Annoyed, Pilate exclaimed, "Do you refuse to speak to me? Don't you realize I have power either to free you or to crucify you?" Jesus then broke his silence. "You would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin." Jesus' words left Pilate deeply troubled. He went out again, determined to release Jesus. But the Jewish leaders had one final card to play. "If you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar," they shouted. "Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar." These words struck Pilate where he was most vulnerable, his political loyalty. He knew that an accusation of disloyalty to Rome could cost him not just his position, but his life. With visible reluctance, Pilate gave in to the pressure. He brought Jesus out one last time and took his seat on the judge's bench. It was almost noon, and the sky remained strangely dark. Pilate, with a gesture of defeat, declared to the crowd, "Behold your king." But the crowd responded with fury, "Away with him! Crucify him!" In a final attempt, Pilate asked, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priests replied with a statement that would echo through the ages, "We have no king but Caesar." With those words, Jesus' fate was sealed. Pilate, in a symbolic gesture of washing his hands, declared himself innocent of this man's blood. The crowd, in their blind rage, took on the responsibility. "Let his blood be on us and on our children." It was a declaration of terrible consequences, the weight of which they could scarcely comprehend at the time. Jesus was then handed over to the soldiers to be crucified, while Barabbas, the man they had chosen, disappeared into the streets of Jerusalem, free but forever tied to this pivotal moment in history. The choice had been made, a choice that would reverberate through time. The people had chosen Barabbas, a symbol of violent rebellion, over Jesus, the preacher of love and peace. As Jesus was led out of the city to be crucified, the darkness over Jerusalem seemed to deepen, as if the very heavens were mourning. The city, which only days before had welcomed Jesus with palm branches and cries of Hosanna, now sent him to his death with shouts of "Crucify him." It was the beginning of a journey that would change the world forever. The streets of Jerusalem, which had recently buzzed with the cries of the crowd, were now strangely silent. A somber procession began to form at the city gates. At the front, surrounded by Roman soldiers, walked Jesus. His steps were slow and painful, each movement a struggle against the pain and exhaustion. The horizontal beam of the cross weighed heavily on his wounded shoulders, a burden both physical and symbolic. The path ahead of him was known as the Via Dolorosa, the way of suffering. Behind Jesus, 2 other condemned men were being led to their execution. Common thieves, their crimes seemed trivial compared to the charges against Jesus. They watched with a mix of fear and curiosity at the man walking ahead of them. They had heard about him, of course. Who in Jerusalem didn't know the stories of the Galilean preacher? Now seeing him bleeding and staggering, they wondered what kind of threat he could have posed to deserve such a punishment. As the procession made its way through the narrow streets, a crowd began to form. Some were curious, drawn by the macabre spectacle. Others were followers of Jesus, keeping a fearful distance, their hearts broken at the sight of their master suffering. Among them were some women who couldn't hold back their tears at the dreadful scene. Their sobs echoed through the streets, a lament for the injustice being done. Jesus, despite his condition, noticed the women crying. With great effort, he turned to them and said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me. Weep for yourselves and for your children." His words, filled with compassion and foresight, surprised everyone. Even in that moment of extreme suffering, his thoughts were turned to others, to the future he knew was coming. The women fell silent, stunned by the strength and wisdom emanating from this broken man. The weight of the cross soon proved too much for Jesus. Weakened by the night of torture and loss of blood, he stumbled and fell, the crushing weight of the wood pressing him against the stones of the street. The soldiers, impatient with the delay, looked around for someone to help. Their eyes fell on a man in the crowd, a stranger from Cyrene named Simon. With harsh shouts and pushes, the soldiers forced Simon to carry Jesus' cross. Simon, taken by surprise, initially resisted. He was in the city only for Passover and didn't want to get involved in this terrible situation. But under the soldiers' threats, he had no choice. Taking the cross, he felt its overwhelming weight, not just physically but emotionally as well. As he walked behind Jesus, Simon began to sense that this moment, though unwelcome, would be a turning point in his life. He looked at the bleeding man ahead of him and felt a mix of pity and admiration. The procession continued its tortuous path through the streets of Jerusalem. The news of Jesus' condemnation spread quickly, and more people joined the crowd following the group. Among them were some of Jesus' disciples, keeping hidden, afraid of being recognized and arrested. They watched with horror and disbelief, unable to comprehend how things had come to this point. Where were the miracles now? Where was the power they had witnessed so many times? As they approached the city gates, the sky grew darker and darker. It wasn't just the approach of noon. An unusual and oppressive darkness seemed to settle over Jerusalem. Many in the crowd looked up at the sky with apprehension, interpreting the darkness as a divine sign. Some whispered that it was God's wrath descending upon the city. Others, recalling Jesus' words about the end times, wondered if this might be the beginning of the judgment he had prophesied. Finally, the group reached the place of execution, a hill outside the city walls known as Golgotha, or the place of the skull. It was a grim location, marked by death and suffering. The smell of blood and decay lingered in the air, mingling with the acrid odor of fear and anticipation. The Roman soldiers, with brutal efficiency, began the final preparations for the crucifixion. They offered Jesus wine mixed with myrrh, a drink meant to numb the pain, but he refused it. With practiced movements, the soldiers laid Jesus on the cross. The sound of hammers driving in the nails echoed across the hill, each strike causing the crowd to shudder. Jesus did not scream, nor did he curse his executioners. Instead, amidst unimaginable pain, he spoke, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." His words left the soldiers perplexed. They had crucified many men, but they had never heard anyone react this way. As the cross was lifted, positioning Jesus between the 2 thieves, the crowd reacted in various ways. Some mocked, shouting insults and challenges. "If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross," they yelled. Others watched in silence, shocked by the brutality of the scene. Jesus' followers, gathered at a safe distance, wept quietly, their hopes and dreams seemingly dying along with their master. The Roman soldiers, having completed their task, were now busy dividing Jesus' clothes among themselves. They cast lots for his tunic, a seamless garment woven from top to bottom. Unknowingly, they were fulfilling an ancient prophecy written centuries before. They divided my clothes among them and cast lots for my garment. The scene was a strange contrast, the banality of soldiers casting lots at the feet of a man dying in agony. Above Jesus' head, Pilate had ordered a sign to be placed: Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. The inscription was written in Aramaic, Latin, and Greek so that everyone could read it. The chief priests protested, arguing that it should say, "This man claimed to be the King of the Jews." But Pilate, perhaps in a final act of defiance, refused to change the text. "What I have written, was his final response. As the hours passed, the darkness over Jerusalem grew more intense. It wasn't a natural darkness. It was as if the very light was being drained from the world. The crowd at the foot of the cross ebbed and flowed, some leaving horrified, others arriving, drawn by the rumors of what was happening. The two thieves crucified with Jesus had different reactions. One mocked, joining in the crowd's insults. The other, however, rebuked his companion. This second thief, turning to Jesus with difficulty, said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." His voice was weak but filled with surprising faith. Jesus, amidst his own agony, responded with compassion, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." These words, exchanged between two dying men, carried an eternal weight that few in the crowd could grasp. Amidst the scattered crowd, a small group remained faithful, refusing to abandon Jesus in his final moments. Among them was Mary, the mother of Jesus, her heart broken at the sight of her son's suffering. By her side was John, the beloved disciple, and a few other women who had followed Jesus from Galilee. They stood there, powerless, but determined to be present until the end. Jesus, seeing his mother and the beloved disciple, spoke again. To his mother he said, "Woman, here is your son." And to John, "Here is your mother." With these words, even in his final moments, Jesus demonstrated his care and love, ensuring that his mother would be cared for after his departure. John, understanding the profound meaning of this gesture, took Mary into his care from that moment on. As the afternoon advanced, the darkness became almost tangible. It was as if night had fallen in the middle of the day. The crowd, uneasy and frightened, began to disperse. Many beat their chests and returned to the city, disturbed by what they had witnessed. The Roman soldiers remained at their posts, but even they seemed unsettled by the supernatural atmosphere enveloping Golgotha. Suddenly a cry pierced the air, echoing across the hill and beyond. "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani?" My God, why have you forsaken me?" It was Jesus quoting the words of Psalm 22. His voice, filled with anguish and loneliness, touched even the hardest hearts. Some in the crowd, not understanding Aramaic, thought he was calling for Elijah. They waited, curious to see if the great prophet would come to rescue him. The following hours were marked by palpable tension. Life slowly ebbed from Jesus, each breath a struggle against pain and suffocation. The crowd watched in heavy silence, as if time itself had slowed down. Then, with one final effort, Jesus cried out loudly, "It is finished." His words echoed across the hill, carrying a weight of finality and fulfillment that few could grasp at that moment. With these words, Jesus bowed his head and gave up his spirit. At the moment he breathed his last, extraordinary events began to unfold. The temple veil, a massive curtain separating the holy place from the most holy place, tore from top to bottom. The earth shook, rocks split, and tombs opened. It was as if creation itself was reacting to the death of its creator. The Roman centurion stationed at the foot of the cross watched everything with wide eyes. He had overseen many crucifixions before, but he had never witnessed anything like this. The supernatural darkness, the earthquake, and above all, the way Jesus faced his death. Everything left him deeply shaken. Turning to his companions, he declared with a trembling voice, "Truly, this man was the Son of God." His words, coming from a Roman soldier, carried a special weight, echoing across the hill and touching the hearts of those present. Meanwhile, in the city, chaos reigned. The earthquake had caused widespread panic. People were running through the streets, seeking shelter and safety. In the temple, the priests were in shock. The torn veil, that massive curtain that had for centuries separated the people from the most sacred place, now hung in tatters. It was a powerful sign, but its full meaning was not yet understood. Some of the younger priests looked at the torn veil with a mix of fear and awe, whispering among themselves about what it might signify. Back at Golgotha, the crowd began to disperse rapidly. The Sabbath was approaching, and with it, the start of Passover. The Jewish leaders, eager to maintain the festival's purity, went to Pilate with an urgent request. They wanted the legs of the crucified men to be broken, hastening their deaths so the bodies could be removed before sunset. Pilate agreed, sending soldiers to carry out the task. The soldiers arrived at the hill and proceeded with their grim task. They broke the legs of the two thieves, who were still alive, causing cries of agony. But when they came to Jesus, they realized he was already dead. One of the soldiers, to be certain, pierced Jesus' side with a spear. To everyone's surprise, blood and water flowed from the wound, a detail that would be remembered and discussed by future generations. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, two men were about to come into view. Joseph of Arimathea, a respected member of the Sanhedrin who was secretly a disciple of Jesus, boldly went to Pilate to request Jesus' body. Nicodemus, another Jewish leader who had once met with Jesus at night, joined Joseph, bringing a mixture of myrrh and aloes for the burial. These two men, who had once feared openly expressing their faith, now risked everything to give Jesus a dignified burial. Pilate, surprised to learn that Jesus was already dead, ordered a centurion to confirm the fact. When he received confirmation, he granted Joseph's request. With care and reverence, Joseph and Nicodemus removed Jesus' body from the cross. They wrapped it in clean linen, mixing the spices according to Jewish burial customs. The body, once marked by violence and suffering, was now treated with the utmost respect and care. Not far from the crucifixion site, there was a garden, and in it, a new tomb that Joseph had had cut out of rock for himself. That was where they took Jesus' body. Time was short, with the Sabbath approaching rapidly. They placed the body in the tomb and rolled a large stone to close the entrance. The women who had followed Jesus from Galilee watched from a distance, carefully noting where the body was laid. As Joseph and Nicodemus performed their solemn task, Jesus' disciples were scattered throughout the city, hiding and fearful. The news of their master's death had left them devastated and confused. They gathered in small groups, doors locked, fearing that the authorities might come after them next. Jesus' words about his death and resurrection, once enigmatic, now seemed a cruel irony. How could they continue without him? What would happen to the message he had preached? The next morning, the chief priests and Pharisees went to Pilate again. Despite it being the Sabbath, they were anxious. "Sir," they said, "we remember that while he was still alive, that impostor said, 'After 3 days I will rise again.' So give the order for the tomb to be made secure until the 3rd day, otherwise his disciples may come and steal the body and tell the people, 'He has been raised from the dead.' This last deception will be worse than the first." Pilate, tired of the whole matter, replied briefly, "You have a guard. Go, make it as secure as you know how." So soldiers were sent to guard the tomb. They sealed the stone and set a guard, determined to prevent any attempt to steal the body. Little did they know they were about to become witnesses to something that would change the course of history. As the city of Jerusalem prepared to celebrate Passover, a tense silence hung over the garden where Jesus was buried. It was a silence filled with expectation, as if all creation was holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. The women who had followed Jesus, including Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James and Salome, spent the Sabbath in silent mourning. They had prepared spices and ointments to anoint Jesus' body, planning to return to the tomb as soon as the Sabbath ended. Their hearts were heavy with the pain of loss, but also with a sense of duty and love that drove them to perform this final service for their master. Meanwhile, the disciples remained hidden, fearful, and confused. Peter, in particular, was consumed with guilt. His denial of Jesus, repeated 3 times as his master had predicted, tormented him. He wept bitterly, remembering Jesus' look after the rooster crowed. John, the beloved disciple, tried to comfort the others, but he himself was struggling to understand the events of the past few days. In the city, rumors began to spread. Some spoke of the strange events that had occurred during the crucifixion, the supernatural darkness, the earthquake, the torn veil of the temple. Others whispered about Jesus' last words and the way he had faced death. Even those who had shouted for his crucifixion were starting to feel uneasy, questioning whether they had made a terrible mistake. The religious leaders, on the other hand, tried to maintain a facade of normalcy. They proceeded with the Passover rituals, but there was an underlying tension in their actions. Some of them couldn't shake the feeling that something monumental had happened, something they still didn't fully understand. Caiaphas, the high priest, was particularly anxious, fearing that Jesus' followers might cause trouble during the festivities. As the Sabbath came to an end and night fell over Jerusalem, a silent expectancy hung in the air. No one knew for sure what the dawn would bring, but there was a widespread sense that the events of the past few days were merely the prelude to something even greater. In the garden, the guards remained vigilant, their eyes fixed on the sealed stone that closed the tomb. They had no idea they were about to witness the most extraordinary event in human history. As the night advanced, the stars shone brightly over Jerusalem, as if the very sky was anticipating what was to come. In the silent tomb, where Jesus' body lay wrapped in linen and spices, something was about to happen that would defy all human understanding and change the course of history forever. The third day was approaching, and with it, a promise of hope and new life that no one could have imagined. The first light of dawn had barely touched the horizon when Mary Magdalene, accompanied by other women, made her way toward the tomb. Their steps were heavy with sorrow, but also with a sense of purpose. They carried the oils and spices they had prepared, determined to perform one last act of love and respect for their master. The morning air was fresh and quiet, as if all creation was holding its breath in anticipation. As they approached the garden, a concern arose among them. Who will roll away the stone for us? The large slab sealing the entrance to the tomb was too heavy for them to move on their own. However, upon arriving at the site, a shocking sight awaited them. The stone had already been rolled away as if it were light as a feather. The tomb was open, its dark entrance an inviting and mysterious void. Mary Magdalene, overcome with panic, ran back to the city to inform the disciples. Meanwhile, the other women, gathering their courage, entered the tomb. What they saw left them astonished. Jesus' body was gone. In its place, sitting where the body should have been, was a young man dressed in dazzling white. The initial terror of the women gave way to reverent awe as the angelic being spoke. "Do not be afraid. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him." The angel's words echoed in the empty tomb, carrying a meaning that the women could barely comprehend. He has risen. The phrase hung in the air, defying everything they had believed possible. The angel continued, instructing them to go and tell the disciples, especially Peter, that Jesus was alive and would meet them in Galilee. Trembling and confused, the women left the tomb, their hearts flooded with a mix of fear and joy. Meanwhile, in the city, Mary Magdalene had arrived breathlessly at the house where Peter and John were hiding. "They have taken the Lord's body," she exclaimed, words coming out in gasps, "and we do not know where they have put him." Peter and John, spurred by the urgency in her voice, ran to the tomb. John, being younger, arrived first but hesitated at the entrance. Peter, arriving shortly after, went in without hesitation. Inside the tomb, they found the linen strips that had wrapped Jesus' body, carefully folded and set aside. The cloth that had covered Jesus' face was separated, folded in a place by itself. The scene left them perplexed. It did not appear to be the work of tomb robbers, who would have left everything in disarray. There was an order, an intentionality to the scene that defied simple explanations. As Peter and John tried to process what they were seeing, Mary Magdalene had returned to the tomb. Standing outside, crying, she leaned in to look inside the burial cave. To her surprise, she saw two angels dressed in white, sitting where Jesus' body had been. "Woman, why are you crying?" they asked. "They have taken my Lord," she replied, "and I do not know where they have put him." At that moment, turning around, Mary saw a man whom she assumed to be the gardener. "Sir," she pleaded, "if you have carried him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will take him." The man simply replied, calling her by name, "Mary." At that instant, upon hearing his voice, Mary recognized him. It was Jesus, alive and standing before her. With a cry of joy, she rushed toward him, but Jesus gently stopped her. "Do not hold on to me," he said, "for I have not yet ascended to the Father. Go to my brothers and tell them that I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." The news of the resurrection spread quickly among Jesus' followers, though many still struggled to believe. That same evening, with the doors locked for fear of the Jewish leaders, Jesus appeared among them. "Peace be with you," he said, showing them the marks on his hands and side. Incredulity gave way to joy and amazement. Jesus breathed on them, saying, "Receive the Holy Spirit." It was the beginning of a new era, the fulfillment of the promises he had made. In the days that followed, Jesus appeared several times to his disciples and followers. Each encounter rekindled hope and strengthened the faith of those who had followed him. To Thomas, who had doubted, Jesus offered tangible proof, allowing him to touch his wounds. To Peter, who had denied him, Jesus offered forgiveness and restoration, entrusting him with the mission of tending to his flock. The news of the resurrection could not be contained. Even with the religious leaders' attempts to suppress the reports by spreading rumors that the body had been stolen, the truth spread like wildfire. Followers of Jesus, who had been fearful and in hiding, now boldly proclaimed the message of the resurrection throughout the streets of Jerusalem. 40 days after his resurrection, Jesus gathered his disciples one last time. Leading them to the Mount of Olives, he gave them final instructions. "You will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes upon you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria, and to the ends of the earth." With these words, Jesus was lifted up before their eyes, disappearing into a cloud. The disciples stood there gazing up at the sky until two men dressed in white appeared beside them. "Men of Galilee," they said, "why do you stand looking up into heaven? This same Jesus who has been taken from you into heaven will come back in the same way you have seen him go into heaven." With this promise, the disciples returned to Jerusalem, their hearts full of joy and purpose. The story of the choice of Barabbas and the crucifixion of Jesus had reached its unexpected climax. The man whom the people had rejected, choosing a criminal in his place, had triumphed over death itself. The cross, once a symbol of shame and defeat, had become a symbol of victory and hope. The empty tomb remained as a silent testimony that death did not have the final word. Transformed by the power of the resurrection, Jesus' followers began to spread the message throughout the known world. The choice made that morning in Jerusalem, when the crowd shouted, "Crucify him!" Зрение не был концом истории, но началом новой эры. The message of forgiveness, love, and eternal life that Jesus preached continued to echo, challenging hearts and transforming lives. Thus, the story of the people who chose Barabbas became the story of how God transformed the greatest injustice in history into his greatest act of love. The freed criminal became a symbol of the forgiveness offered to all, and Jesus, the rejected and crucified man, became the way to reconciliation with God, offering hope and new life to all who believe. The choice made that day in Jerusalem reverberates through the centuries, inviting each person to make their own choice, to accept or reject the love and forgiveness offered through Jesus. And so, the story continues, alive and relevant, challenging each generation to carefully consider their own choices and the eternal impact they may have. I hope you enjoyed this content. I humbly ask that you subscribe and leave a like so you can follow our future videos. Thank you for being here. May God bless you abundantly.